Did you know that Active Directory is exploited in 9 out of 10 cyber attacks? With access to Active Directory, attackers can gain control of your network. To keep attackers out, you need to find and fix Active Directory security gaps. Meet Purple Knight, a free security assessment tool that scans your environment for hundreds of vulnerabilities and helps you fix the problems. Ready to reduce your Active Directory attack surface? Download Purple Knight, the #1 Active Directory security vulnerability assessment tool. Visit securityweekly.com/Sempiris. Why is identity resilience a top priority for security executives? Because your identity access management or IAM system is critical to your business. Whether you use Okta, Microsoft Entra, or another IDP, if your IAM is attacked, your operations can go down for hours or days, directly impacting your bottom line. So what's your backup plan? Mighty ID is here to save the day, reinforcing your IAM resilience. With flexible backup and recovery, and even migration between IDPs, Mighty ID keeps business running when failure is not an option. Check out Mighty ID at securityweekly.com/Mighty ID for more.
Created in 2005 and hosted by security industry veterans, Paul Security Weekly is your source for in-depth coverage of the latest vulnerabilities, exploits, and security research. Our weekly security news discussion dives deep into the security issues we face today and potential solutions in a fun and lively atmosphere. Each week, we bring on guests from the security community to learn about their journey and discuss topics relevant to their work and research. You can also subscribe to our show by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe or look for Paul Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher. We've recorded a ton of content over the years, so we created Spotify playlists featuring some of our favorite episodes, including interviews with Marcus Random, John McAfee, and Chris Roberts, to name a few. You can find them at securityweekly.com/starter packs.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Jason Albuquerque and Malcolm Harkins. Get ready for an electrifying experience at the 15th Annual Identiverse. Join over 3,000 identity professionals at the Aria Resort and Casino in Las Vegas on May 28th to 31st for 4 days packed with dynamic learning and collaboration. Don't miss out on keynote speakers including Danae DeFore, CISO of United Airlines, Tucker Bryant, entrepreneur and former Googler, George Roberts, Director of Identity and Access Engineering at McDonald's, and many more. As a community member, receive 25% off your Identiverse 2024 tickets using code IDV24-SW25. Register today at securityweekly.com/IDV2024. All right, gentlemen, we are back for the second segment of our Say Easy, Do Hard. And this segment is really to try to create some recommendations. Let's do the hard part. And so in the last segment, we talked about the importance of why you need to train like you fight and be prepared for incidents. In this segment, I want to start, and Malcolm, you started down this path a little bit in the first segment on where do you start? And I didn't want to dig into this too much in the last segment because I think it's a perfect intro to this segment is start with materiality.
Or the extinction events. I love that.
Yeah, the extinction events.
I
Yeah,
love
I mean,
that.
I mean, it's the easiest way, again, former finance person, people talk about they've got budget problems, staffing problems, stuff like that. I go, that's a prioritization problem. If you can do nothing else other than understand and mitigate extinction level event, you're doing your job. As long as everybody understands that's only what you're capable of managing the risk around.
yes. And using those extinction events is where you probably start your practice planning process, right? Because I mean, the first thing you have to do is start to build out a plan for incident response. And so I assume the extinction events are the starting point to start to build some of these plans and then eventually test towards those plans. Any specific order to how you build these plans out?
For me, like I said, if you start with those and just, hopefully there's a handful, right, that you can start with, and then just start picking them off. And don't be limited, like the example I gave for food and beverage. Don't be limited to traditional cyber. Look at an extinction event for the business, and then go, what could a cyber related thing do to trigger as a direct cause or be an indirect contributor to exacerbate something else that's occurring. And I think if you can do that, then you're going to also be able to, the discussion of how do you get alignment with the business. Well, if I'm in the food and beverage organization, I'm like, hey, we've got a food safety person. They're worried about food safety so that we don't kill and make people sick, right? Okay, great. Let me go business partner with them and show them that if I can manipulate that data, I could trigger that. Okay, now I've got somebody who gives a crap and then will then go work on that with me. Now, then just go figure that out in whatever your business is, right?
Yeah, Malcolm, I was gonna say that. We talk a lot on this show about cyber professionals learning the business, speaking the language of the business, getting aligned with the business, right? And going out there and identifying these extinction level events allows you to dig in and drive into the business and learn more about the business. So that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to get aligned with stakeholders. It's an opportunity to learn more about the business and really start influencing at that level. Because again, if we go in there talking about the bits and bytes every day, we're not going to be influencing at the level we need to. So going out there, learning the business, figuring out what extinction level events are, what those risks are, I think is super important to not only do your job, but also get that buy-in, trust, and alignment to the other stakeholders in the business.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of organizations have an enterprise risk map at some level, right? Legal runs it, finance runs it.
Yep.
You have a corporate insurance person. Somebody's doing corporate insurance. Go talk to them and go, what are we insuring against? Where do we
Yep.
have extra coverage for certain things? Well, okay, that's a beginning spot of what could create a big oh shit moment, right?
Mhm.
And just start with that and then go figure out then who's managing a physical aspect, a business aspect of it. Again, I'll give you an Intel example. Again, 22, almost 23 years ago, again, enterprise risk map. Luckily, I had helped create it when I was in finance in the late 90s, so I understood it. But you go, okay, sole source factory in Oregon, manufacturing the highest margin product, sole source in an earthquake zone. Guess what was on the enterprise risk
That's
map?
right.
Okay, well, if you have an earthquake and that's disrupted, you just affected output and yield. Well, guess what? I was like, you know what? I don't need an earthquake to have that happen. A cyber event could cause that to happen. All
Mhm.
of a sudden, I have discussions with manufacturer, and they're like, "Well, how? What? Why?" Well, guess what? 5 months later, Slammer happens, right? You saturate a network, you can affect factory output, right? But we had identified that earlier. Again, you go a continuation then to ransomware, right? It's all a continuation of ways in which you could shut down the factory physically or logically.
So as you build these extinction level events out, right? Then you start to build these connections, these trigger points, right? And the trigger point doesn't have to just be cyber as you've been describing, right? It could be nature in itself, but it could be a cyber event. That helps you start to map out scenarios that you could then build tabletop exercises around, right? Because I think this is where the rubber meets the road in this work is then getting people together and starting to run through these scenarios, because this is where things to me get really, really interesting, right? You've got an event that the business doesn't think could actually trigger something. It triggers something. And then as you start to propagate that thing down and see all the other touch points across the other business systems, it's eye-opening to me of all the different things that can happen. And it just gets everybody's attention to be like, well, wait a minute. We didn't think that was a critical system.
Well, the other part of it, we also have to go beyond just looking at ourselves. Protection of my entity is a self-preservation mode, and we're all interdependent upon each other. Look at Colonial Pipeline. Look at what happened with United Healthcare's charging system, right? And the ripple effects that occurred. Think of the shipping container company. I'm drawing a blank on that. Back several years ago, had a ransomware event.
Maersk.
And it
Maersk.
disrupted shipping movement. Okay, well
Yep.
that, I think roughly it was estimated $100 million impact of them because of revenue and shipping and stuff like that. But imagine there was food going to an impoverished nation as a UN donation program, and it didn't get there in time. The food was bad; people could have died. You've got critical medicine on a boat. Well, that could cause a ripple effect. If I had parts, think of the supply chain disruptions we had during the pandemic. So there's a fiduciary and impact on an extinction level event for you, but then there's also the what effect does this have on your customers, and then potentially what effect does this have on society, right? That all
Mm.
have a gradient around materiality.
Yeah, and suppliers have to factor into this mix, right? I mean,
Of
we're
course.
so dependent on the supply chain these days. I mean, the pandemic made it very evident how dependent we are on the supply chains. And you you have to test some of these supply chains, I would imagine, in these plants because look, if you go to look for concentration risks, right? I'm going to tell you where some of them are: Google, Amazon, and Microsoft,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Because they are. They're running critical parts of your
Well,
business
but
and
also
communication.
AT&T, Verizon, everything else.
Absolutely.
You've
Yep.
got networking components. I could even go and say, well, what about NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD, right? Because at the base of all of that ends up being a
Yeah.
processor at the end of the day, and at the base
I
of
mean, every
that,
business is different, right?
controller
I mean,
and BIOS.
depending on your vertical, your logistics company could be your critical mass. If you can't haul things across the country in an 18 wheeler, you're screwed, right? You're losing revenue. So, I mean, it really all depends. You have to. That's the importance, Matt. We talk about all the time is classifying your vendors,
Mhm.
right?
Well,
Because
but
assets aren't just your.
you also should classify yourself relative to your
Mhm.
part in the supply
Yeah.
chain. And if people actually did that, guess what? Our third party risk stuff would be a hell of a lot better
Yeah.
than always
Agreed.
looking at my vendors versus looking at the fact that I'm a vendor to somebody else.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And what's your importance in that stack?
Yeah, and how could you be the cause or trigger of a material event to your customer? Again, I always worried
Right.
about that because I was in the tech sector. And again, if Intel was disrupted and couldn't ship processors to Dell, Dell's revenue would be impacted. And then, somebody else who couldn't buy a PC or a server would be impacted, right? So I always thought about that spot in the compute ecosystem, not only what was coming to me creating risk, but where I was creating potentially risk for others.
Now, Malcolm, once you've identified these extinction plans, these extinction events, you've built out potential scenarios. Are you working with other stakeholders within the organization to build out the actual exercise? Are you tapping other stakeholders, other C-level executives, or folks within the business to say, "All right, I want to build out this exercise. I need your feedback. Let's build this out together, so that way we have something that's value add to the entire organization."
Yeah, I do. But I've also, this is going to sound kind of bad, but I'll state it anyways. Every incident and emergency process that I ever built or operated was intended to keep executives out of it. They don't make
Yep.
good incident response people. Their job is to keep informed and to make decisions and to help communicate at certain points of time to certain audiences. Other than that, you don't want them managing the incident because they're not then doing their job as CEO, CFO, whatever. They have a particular role, let them do it. So build your incident response plan with people with boots on the ground that are going to be the people in the fight, not the people in the Pentagon that you need to stay informed,
Yep.
right? Because you don't want that time delay. You want them there for clarity,
Yep.
questions, and decision making.
So they play the C and the I in the RACI model
Yeah,
That's right.
mostly,
yeah, they can
right?
veto some things or just, but otherwise they're not doing their job. I mean, it's no different. Take a sports analogy. You run drills on the field and you're playing football. The head coach is not the person on the field running the thing. They're all got a mic, they're listening to other things, and they're providing input based upon their field of view and their decisions. But the quarterback and the people on the field are the ones that need to be drilled. It's communication and collaboration with the other executives, not fighting.
No, that's right.
It's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the RACI model is a big component of this. Who's responsible and accountable for these different steps? Who do you consult and inform along these steps? I mean, obviously, that's part of the planning process, and also kind of it again tells you who's the quarterback on the field, right? And who else needs to be involved in any step. I think that's a very important step as part of planning. Once you have the plans in place, I want to talk about practice and how often should you be practicing these events, right? I mean, we get, typical kind of, I think my GRC days, right? We go out and we assess risk, we put it on the shelf, and we don't see it for another year, maybe more in some cases, depending on who you are. How often should these be practiced?
I'd say, well, unfortunately, I think we're getting too much practice because people are having events and incidents one after another after another. So, on the one hand, I always count a real incident as an exercise.
Hmm.
But then it becomes the after action report. What did we learn? What did we do or not do well? And then go tabletop and drill the thing that you didn't do so well on to make sure that you actually followed through on your actions to make improvements. Then, so get those basics down because you're having skirmishes all the time, right? Then I'd go a couple times a year, you do a crazy drill in the extreme to be prepared for the ordinary. But give yourself credit for the things that are going bump. And frankly, when you're in even a small scenario, like did this just last week, we had a small thing that went bump. A couple of people got locked out of access, failed logins. Of course, again, simple thing, simple causes. What did I do? I stress tested. I'm like, well, what if this? What if that? What if this? What if that? And so, even as we were dealing with this basically minor issue that was caused by a configuration thing, we stretched it to go, well, this could have been caused by that. It could have been caused by this. It could have been, and we then, because we did that, we found a few things. Oh, we gotta document this. We got to tighten that up. Again, early stage companies, I would use a minor thing and amplify the potentials around it in order to give us that exercise, right? So you can do it with normal things that have gone bump and then just go, okay, we've dealt with it. Now let's scenario play around it and use that as a way to do basically a mini drill and not have to go into a whole lot of scheduling and, scenario planning and all that other stuff.
Well, that's my next question. How much planning and how much notification do you give in these exercises? Like, I could see one being very planned out, very coordinated, and everybody knows, but there's got to be value to creating an exercise on the fly that nobody has any idea it's coming.
I love doing those. I love being stress tested myself. Again, you because again, the reality is people are on planes, they've got graduations, they've got things at home, they've got other business stuff. So you do want to do a level of random, have a few people who know, and I did this, both at Silence and at Intel. It was like, hey, you go figure it out. Just put a particular month or week, and and I am at where I'm at, and I have to deal with it like everybody else, right? And then you also can test is who's the backup, right?
Yep.
If you only have one person who can make a certain decision or access the system to do something, you got a single point of failure. It's also a great way to, again, validate that your call trees, if Malcolm didn't pick up and he's supposed to be running corporate emergency operations, who's second in command? Right?
Now, Malcolm, when you're running these exercises, do you have somebody keeping score? Someone actually tallying the areas of improvement, more like a facilitator, someone who's a little bit separated from the exercise, who can Because
you
in
want to,
chaos, you're not always going to be remember what areas you need to improve on, right? Do you
yeah,
have that person who
yeah,
facilitates?
you want to scribe, because
Yeah.
because again, even the facilitator though, they're immersed in it, so they're not going to capture the
Yep.
dialogues or the quick things that somebody might slack, and so I just thought about this but I don't want to distract it or whatever. So I'd say you have a facilitator, you have a scribe. That scribe's job is to just watch, listen, absorb.
Yep.
And anytime somebody says, well, what about this, what about that, well, we don't have a good answer for that. Okay, grab it, bin it, keep
Yep. Parking
moving on
lot
that
it, and you
subject.
can cover it later. Yep.
And
Yeah, because
literally,
that
like I said,
ties.
the thing that we had a little thing that went bump last week, we had somebody when we were doing it, and I started throwing out all these different things. And what they were doing was basically writing all that stuff down and saying, yep, we'll follow up on it. Yep, we'll follow up on it. And then
Yep.
that spawned a bunch of other things. And guess what? We had, a punch list of 10 things that says, hey, we should, because of this, we just thought about other ways in which this could have occurred, and we had to go, do some instrumentation to alert for those. In one case, another case, it's just having basically a backup capability for logs, right?
Yeah.
Do you leverage folks from outside of your organization to brainstorm different event scenarios, emerging threats? Because in the confines of your own company, you're kind of in a bubble, right? So I think collaboration is huge, whether it's within ISAC or a law enforcement organization, one of the three-letter agencies, something like that, InfraGard. Having those external resources that can give you ideas on different exercises, bring them back to your organization and actually see if it's if it's an extinction level event or if it's a high risk.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, there are either industry segment components, location segment components. Heck, I've been used by friends and I've used friends to actually sometimes participate as an instigator, as a facilitator, right? And help me get out of my own sometimes myopic view that can occur.
Yeah, you learn so much that at the end, I mean, you've got to break these down afterwards, right? I mean, there has to be this continual improvement process. How quickly? So this was something that I took away from our last exercise. If you don't do those pretty quickly after, you start to forget some of the details. So how quickly should you be doing the postmortems to think about all these areas to make those improvements back into the plan?
Yeah, I think you're doing the if you have the right scribe, you're doing the post-mortem while you're actually doing it because that's
Mm.
getting documented. And then it's just a review that determines the potential priority, because you might end up with this laundry list of stuff and then you just have to go, okay, well, let's consolidate, let's trim it, let's prioritize it so that you don't have 100 things and you whittle it to the 10 things you can get done, let's say in the next, in some cases it could be next 2 hours. Other cases it could be, okay, that's going to be a longer term project. Okay, well, we're going to have to put that into our next financial planning exercise because we're going to have
Right.
to dedicate 3 people in 3 months to it, right?
Yeah, and that's when you sit back, assess the risk, assess the investment, build out the project, and now you have that remediation. That's more of a long tail remediation.
Yeah, or you might find something that you go, oh crap, this is a big heavy lift. We have an architectural flaw that allows for, that's going to cost, $5 million and a year and a half of work to go deal with. Okay, well, if you uncover that, that's a different dialogue and a different
Right.
discussion. And again, getting back to materiality, if it's a probable thing that is exploitable, that could cause a material event, guess what? It probably should be summarized in some level in your 10K, like the loss of a factory that's sole source and an earthquake that could cause a disruption. If you have those, that's where you put it in your 10K. 8K is for the 4 day rule. Again, not just cyber, anything that's material that happens, you have 4 days to report it in an 8K. 10K is for these systemic things that are potentially material that you might not be able to properly or fully mitigate the risk.
Yeah, so let's walk through that scenario quickly because I think this is good guidance for people, right? We're going to use your plan example in Utah. It's a systemic potential risk. It's in my 10K. An earthquake or a cyber event actually happens at that facility. That's when the 8K kicks in, right?
Correct.
Because you've identified it as a systemic potential risk in your 10K, but the actual event when it happens that interrupts that plant becomes the 8K reporting requirement.
Correct. Now, but let's think forward. AI. There's manufacturing companies that are using AI to optimize factory output. Some of them have already published case studies that they've delivered hundreds of millions of dollars of EBITDA benefit, earnings before income and taxes, avoided billions of dollars of cost of factory operations. Guess what? That's material benefit. Guess what? If your AI is attacked,
Yeah.
it's a material risk.
It's your risk. Yep.
Right? So now you go from the traditional ransomware and industrial control systems or outage or earthquake or fire. I've got AI helping optimize factory performance, creating material benefit. If AI is attacked or breached, it's a material risk.
Hmm.
Well, guess what? If you haven't managed it, you should be putting in your 10K. I have AI in use in my company that we're don't have potentially full capability to manage the risks around that could cause a material risk, right? So
Yeah.
that's where you have to always evaluate the technology. When we shifted to cloud, if you didn't have cloud security controls and the cloud transition was creating material benefit, you should have been disclosing in your 10K the potential for material risk.
And then you need to test scenarios around AI attacks that you should exercise for to prepare for in the eventual event that it actually happens.
Exactly.
See, we just tied what you should be disclosing in your 10K, systemic risk wise that impacts materiality, an 8K event, which you should actually probably plan for prior to needing to file your 8K. Otherwise, you don't know that you have to file the 8K.
Correct. Yeah, that planning should be in Malcolm Strong opinion 90+% pre-plumbed. You should already know all that stuff. And then you've got templates and you know, and you're grabbing the finance folks, the legal folks, and they're making the final determination of the thing that went bump that tied to something that was already determined to create a material impact. Is it, are we required to disclose it or not?
Yeah.
And all the people that were doing the CYA tells me they didn't actually understand what was material. And so they just rushed and said, well, we're going to say it so that we don't have liability later.
Yeah, they were hitting the easy button because they didn't do the job up front. They didn't do the hard work up front, right?
Yep.
Right. And I think, Malcolm, what you've done is articulated a really good approach to think about how these pieces fit together. Because I think this is the challenge that organizations now have to get their arms around is understand those extinction level events. What is material? Identify those in my 10K. Prepare plans for those, test against those plans so that if something does happen, not only do you know that you need to file the 8K, you're actually prepared to uh, mitigate the event as it's happening. So it's kind of dual benefit. It's preparing you for the 8K, but also protecting the organization from the extinction level event.
Exactly. And then do mock depositions because your communication will be weaponized against you. And again, a dialogue I had with a peer the other day, we were talking about incident response, out of band communication, stuff like that. And they're like, yeah, we're getting to formalize choosing blah as our out of band communication. Having been deposed too many times, I said, okay, great. Imagine, I said, as soon as you believe that you might be sued for something, you have the obligation to preserve all communications, text, phone, email,
Mm-hmm.
Slack. Guess what? Out of band communications. And if you then don't preserve that, imagine you're getting deposed and you said, hey, did you use out of band communications for incident response? Yes. Why? Well, because it was easier and blah, 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 and preserve the confidentiality. So do you have any reason to believe that your communication mechanisms were compromised? No. Okay, now you just lined yourself up for a kill shot from a plaintiff's attorney saying that they're going to then make the case that you were intentionally hiding communications through out of band communication for no good reason.
Yep. And then how do you practice that response?
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Which is why you go, if you're going to use out of band communications for stuff, you have to have a trigger. We suspect our communications are compromised. Right? Or we're communicating with external third parties that are a part of it, and it becomes a trigger. And then you still have to have the obligation for preservation if you believe you're going to be sued.
Right.
In which case you create a manual record. I texted Matt on this out-of-band encrypted communication channel, and I asked him this question. His response was this, and you keep a handwritten set of notes because you have the obligation to preserve from discovery, for discovery purposes.
Yeah. How many of us are prepared for that?
But that also gets to be prepare for the fight, because that will also be a part of the fight, not just the cyber fight, the liability and legal response fight that will come afterwards. And if you're not doing that preparation, you're also not truly preparing for a fight.
Yeah, so we started with incident response, but now you got to prepare for deposition and practice like you train like you fight over there as well.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, that's the long tail of the battle, though, to keep it in military terms, right? That's the long tail of the battle. It's not just the firefight that day. It's that long tail of battle.
Yep.
Malcolm, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you.
And Jason, always a great topic this time around. Thank you, sir, and thank you for everyone watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.